All right, welcome to another episode of The Deep Dive. You know what we do here, right? We take a complex subject, break it down, and give you the info you need to truly understand it.
And today, we're doing that with the concept of philanthropy. We're going to be looking at it, well, kind of like philosophers would.
Exactly. We're going deep beyond just defining what philanthropy is into its history, ethics, the politics of it all, you name it.
We'll be drawing from the philanthropy entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, a really recent one published in November 2024.
So we're talking brand new insights, fresh perspectives, all to equip you to think critically about giving and what it means in the world today.
The goal is to make you, the listener, seriously well-informed about this practice that's been around, well, basically forever, but is always evolving.
So let's start with that, the practice itself. The entry defines philanthropy as, and it's pretty straightforward, the voluntary contribution of money or resources for broadly public purposes.
And there are a few important things to unpack right there. First, it's voluntary. You're choosing to give, not like taxes, which are mandatory.
Right, and you get to decide where your contribution goes and how it's used. It's not just blindly handing over cash.
And importantly, you don't get paid back directly for giving, though there might be other benefits, like, that warm, fuzzy feeling.
Yeah, or maybe a boost to your reputation or some tasty tax deductions.
But let's talk about public purpose for a second.
Hmm.
We're using that term broadly here. Basically, any gift that benefits others counts. So we're not talking about gifts to family or friends or donations to political campaigns.
Makes sense. We're really zeroing in on philanthropy's impact on the community, society as a whole.
And this is where our philosophical lens comes in. Because, as the entry points out, simply defining the act of giving doesn't tell us the whole story.
Right, it's not just about checking off a box like, did I give? Yes. Okay, done.
It's about understanding the history, the ethics, the power dynamics, all of that messy stuff that's interwoven with the act of giving.
It's about the why behind the giving, not just the what.
And that's why we're going to be exploring all these different perspectives. Is it about personal virtue, societal obligation, something else entirely?
And just so everyone's clear, we'll be using charity and philanthropy pretty much interchangeably, but we'll also be digging into their relationship with justice, which is a whole other can of worms.
Oh, absolutely. So let's get into the history then. What's fascinating is that giving to people outside our immediate circle is something humans have done across cultures and throughout time.
Really makes you wonder if there's something hardwired in us to be, well, altruistic.
The entry even touches on that, the potential biological roots of altruism. But how we interpret and value giving, well, that's a whole other story, and it's changed a lot over the centuries.
Yeah, like even the word philanthropy itself has this whole backstory. It comes from the ancient Greek philanthropia, which originally meant the god's love for humankind.
Imagine that divine love as the first example of philanthropy.
And the entry brings up a great example from Greek mythology, Prometheus, the guy who gave fire to humans.
Oh, yeah, the one who got in trouble with Zeus for being too generous.
Exactly. And that already raises some interesting questions about, like, who deserves their generosity and how far we should go with it.
Then you've got the Romans with their term beneficentia, which was more about the positive outcomes of giving, less about the giver's intentions.
So more like, did it help? Great. Less about, were you being truly selfless?
Right. And Cicero, the Roman philosopher, he wrote a whole book, De Officiis, that laid out how giving was supposed to work in Roman society.
Sounds like a Roman guide to proper giving etiquette.
In a way, yeah. And both the Greeks and the Romans, they were big on gifts that benefited the whole city. Things like building projects and festivals. They called them liturgia.
And from what I understand, this wasn't just a suggestion. There could be serious consequences if wealthy citizens didn't step up and contribute.
Yeah, sometimes reputation, sometimes even more than that. Giving was tied up with social standing and even political power.
Then we jump ahead to the Greek philosophers, like Plato, who in the Republic was pretty critical of wealth and equality, and even proposed that everything should be owned in common.
That's a bold idea, shared ownership as a solution.
Definitely radical for his time. But then you have Aristotle, who, while disagreeing with Plato on that point, also made a case for individual generosity.
Right. He saw it as crucial for building friendships and for living a moral life.
So we've already got this debate brewing, even back then, about the role of private property and the right way to give. And it's a debate that's still going strong today.
It's interesting how these early arguments are still relevant.
Absolutely. Okay, so fast forward to the rise of Christianity. This brought a big shift in how people thought about giving.
Now the emphasis is on agape, or caritas, which means charity or love.
Love for God expressed through love for your fellow humans.
Exactly. And the focus now was on helping the most vulnerable, no matter who they were or where they came from.
So it wasn't just about being generous to your fellow citizens. It was a universal obligation to help those in need, period.
And it wasn't just for the rich either. Everyone, regardless of their own means, was expected to contribute in some way.
And that idea of giving to those in need, well, it shows up in other religious traditions too, right?
Definitely. Take Jewish tzedakah, for example. It's considered a duty of justice to give to the poor, and the amount you give is tied to your own resources and the needs of the recipient.
It's not just random acts of kindness. There's a real system and structure to it.
Right. And Maimonides, a Jewish philosopher, even ranked different approaches to giving. He placed a high value on protecting the dignity of the recipient.
That's really interesting, the idea that how you give matters just as much as what you give.
Absolutely. And in Islam, you have zakat, which is obligatory giving, and sadaqah, which is voluntary. Both are considered important parts of living a faithful life.
So even within one religion, there are different ways to approach giving.
Right. And it's not just about the Abrahamic religions either. Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions all have this concept of dana, which is about giving without expecting anything in return.
It's almost like letting go of attachment to material possessions.
Exactly. And then you have philosophies like Ubuntu from Africa, which emphasizes reciprocal giving as this fundamental expression of our shared humanity.
So what we see is that giving is this universal practice, but the way it's understood and practiced, well, that can vary widely depending on culture and tradition.
It's incredibly diverse, and it's also been challenged and reshaped over time, especially in the modern era.
Right. Once we hit the 18th and 19th centuries, things like industrialization, urbanization, the rise of the modern state, all of that starts to shake things up.
You also have thinkers starting to question why widespread poverty even exists. Is it inevitable? Or is it a result of how society is structured?
And if it's the latter, then who's responsible for fixing it? Is it individuals through charitable giving, or is it the government?
This is where we start to see some strong criticisms of traditional philanthropy. Jeremy Bentham, for example, argued that private charity is just too unreliable for meeting basic needs.
Makes sense. If people's survival depends on the generosity of others, that's not exactly a stable system.
And Kant, he believed that if there's widespread poverty, that's a sign that the government itself is failing to uphold justice.
So for him, it wasn't enough to just throw money at the problem. You had to address the root causes of inequality.
Marx and Engels, they took it even further. They saw charity as basically a band-aid solution that distracts from the exploitative nature of capitalism.
For them, it was about dismantling the whole system, not just making people feel better about its negative effects.
Exactly. And even thinkers who weren't necessarily revolutionaries, like Mary Wollstonecraft, John Stuart Mill, and Jane Addams, they raised concerns about the power dynamics inherent in traditional giving.
It's easy to imagine how those relationships could become imbalanced, the giver holding all the cards.
Right. And there were also critiques aimed at the way philanthropy was structured. During the Enlightenment, a lot of people started questioning the church's control of land and wealth through these perpetual endowments.
That's the idea that money is set aside forever to support a specific cause.
Exactly. And critics like Turgot, Kant, and Montesquieu, they worried about the dead hand of the past controlling resources in the present. They thought it could stifle innovation and progress.
Mill even argued that the state should intervene and potentially redirect these resources to better serve the needs of society.
But it wasn't all about dismantling the old ways. There were also attempts to reimagine philanthropy for a changing world. Thinkers and reformers started seeing its potential for driving social innovation, for building stronger communities, even for pushing back against government overreach.
It's interesting how those ideas about the limits of government and the power of individual initiative, well, they're still very much with us today.
And a key figure here is Andrew Carnegie with his Gospel of Wealth. He believed that those who accumulate great wealth have a moral obligation to use it for the good of society.
So not just hoarding wealth, but actively putting it to work to make the world a better place.
Right, and Henry Sidgwick, another philosopher, he argued for a more strategic and evidence-based approach to giving. He was basically an early advocate for what we now call effective altruism.
This brings us to a fundamental question that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries: the relationship between justice and charity.
It seems pretty simple at first. Charity is voluntary, a good thing to do, but not necessarily an obligation. Justice, on the other hand, is about rights and duties, things we're required to uphold.
Right, like it's just to pay taxes to support public services. But it's not like we're required to donate to a homeless shelter, even if it would be a good thing to do.
But the entry points out that this distinction gets blurry in situations where charitable acts end up addressing needs that should really be met by a just society.
It's like if the government isn't providing adequate health care and people have to rely on private charities to get treatment, is that really charity anymore? Or is it a failure of justice that's being masked by individual generosity?
And some philosophers, like Alan Buchanan, argue that those distinctions aren't so clear-cut. He says that duties of charity can actually become perfect duties, things we're obligated to do, if there are established social institutions that define those obligations.
So it's not always about individual choice.
Mhm.
The context, the structures of society, all of that comes into play.
Right. And then you have Will Kymlicka, who takes a different stance. He believes our primary focus should be on achieving justice through political change, through fixing the systems that create inequality.
So for him, charity is kind of a secondary concern, a band-aid solution until we get those systems right.
He even argues that the true aim of charity should be defined by the demands of justice. If you're giving to address something that's a basic right, well, is that really charity, or is it just fulfilling an obligation?
It's a really thought-provoking perspective. But the entry does point out that a lot of philanthropy isn't about addressing basic needs or correcting injustices.
Right. There's a lot of giving that goes towards things like the arts, education, scientific research, things that enrich society but aren't necessarily about survival or fairness.
So it's not always about fixing what's broken. It can also be about supporting things that make life better, more interesting, more meaningful.
And that brings us to the ethics of giving. And here, virtue ethics offers a really rich perspective. It's not just about following rules or achieving outcomes, it's about the character of the giver.
So it's not just did you do the right thing, it's more like what kind of person are you?
Exactly. And Aristotle, way back in ancient Greece, he laid out some key questions about giving. To whom, how much, when, for what purpose, and how.
It's more complicated than just writing a check, that's for sure.
Virtue ethics is all about cultivating good habits, good character traits. So if you give a ton of money just to brag about it, well, that's not really virtuous.
Yeah, you're not doing it for the right reasons. And the entry points out that this is where phronesis, or practical wisdom, comes in. It's about being thoughtful, using good judgment when you give.
It's not enough to just have good intentions.
Yeah.
You need to understand the needs, the potential impact, all of that.
And that reminds me of something else from the entry. It talks about how we should be more nuanced in our moral judgments. Instead of just saying something is wrong, we should consider if it's untruthful, unjust, maybe even just vulgar or undignified.
Like, imagine a university accepting a huge donation from someone who made their fortune in a really unethical industry. Maybe it's not technically wrong, but it could definitely raise ethical questions about the university's values.
Absolutely. And here's another cool thing about virtue ethics. It doesn't just focus on the giver. It also looks at the moral qualities of the recipient.
Right, like gratitude, the ability to use resources wisely, maintaining self-respect even when you're receiving help.
It's a reminder that both sides of the giving relationship have ethical responsibilities.
Now let's talk about effective altruism, which is a newer approach to philanthropy that's gained a lot of traction in recent years.
This is about maximizing the positive impact of your giving, right? Using evidence and reason to figure out where your money will do the most good.
Exactly. And it's heavily influenced by Peter Singer, who wrote this groundbreaking essay in 1972 called Famine, Affluence, and Morality.
I remember reading that in college.
Yeah.
Use this thought experiment about a drowning child. Would you ruin your clothes to save a child who's drowning right in front of you? Of course you would.
Ooh, right. And then he says, what's the difference between that and a child dying of poverty halfway around the world? The distance shouldn't matter morally. We have an obligation to help those in need, no matter where they are.
That's a powerful argument.
And that's the core of effective altruism. It says we should focus on maximizing good, on doing the most good we can, based on evidence and careful reasoning.
And this idea has led to the creation of some really interesting organizations like Giving What We Can, 80,000 Hours, and GiveWell.
These groups help people figure out which charities are the most effective, where their donations will have the biggest impact.
So it's not just about giving, it's about giving smart.
Right. And while some proponents of effective altruism don't explicitly subscribe to utilitarianism, that idea of maximizing happiness or well-being is definitely there.
And that also means that your personal motivations for giving are less important than the actual results. Even if you're being selfish, if it leads to more good in the world, well, maybe that's okay.
And then there are things like earning to give, where people choose high-paying careers specifically to donate more money.
So it's almost like turning your job into a vehicle for philanthropy.
Exactly. And then there's long-termism, which focuses on ensuring the well-being of future generations, potentially billions of years into the future.
So thinking really big picture about things like climate change and existential risks to humanity.
Right. But effective altruism has its critics too. Some argue that it's too focused on individual actions and doesn't pay enough attention to systemic injustices.
Like, you can donate all you want, but if the system itself is rigged against certain groups of people, that's not going to solve the problem.
Exactly. And there are questions about long-termism too, like, do we really have a greater obligation to future generations than to people who are suffering right now?
It's a debate that's likely to continue for a long time. Okay, so now let's shift gears and talk about non-consequentialist perspectives on philanthropy. And here, Kant's ideas are super relevant.
Kant connects philanthropy to this idea of beneficence, the duty to promote the happiness of others and help those in need.
But for him, it's an imperfect duty, right? Meaning we should do it, but we have some leeway in how we go about it.
Exactly. It's not like a perfect duty, like keeping promises, where it's always wrong to break a promise. With beneficence, you have to use your judgment.
And Kant also has some interesting things to say about the relationship between philanthropy and the role of the state.
Right. He believed the state had a duty to ensure that no one was left in absolute destitution. And he was actually kind of ambivalent about private charity.
Really? Why is that?
On the one hand, he saw it as potentially demeaning to the recipient, like they're being treated as objects of pity rather than as equals. And he also thought it could be a sign of a failing government, that private individuals are having to step in to do what the state should be doing.
So almost like a distraction from the real problem, which is that the government isn't fulfilling its obligations.
But on the other hand, he acknowledged that sometimes people have acquired wealth unjustly. And in those cases, giving back might be a form of reparative justice, trying to right a wrong.
Makes sense. So for Kant, it's not just about being generous, it's about creating a just society where charity isn't even necessary.
Exactly. And for him, that means focusing on principles of mutual respect and accountability rather than just relying on the good intentions of individuals.
So it's not enough to just throw money at problems. We need to create systems and structures that uphold justice for everyone.
Now, all of this leads us to the politics of giving, which is this fascinating and often messy intersection between philanthropy and democracy.
And this has been a topic of debate for centuries. Tocqueville, way back in the 19th century, was already writing about the potential tensions between the two.
And it's not just a concern in democracies either. Even in ancient Rome, there were worries about wealthy citizens using their generosity to gain political power.
Right, like, I'm giving you all this money, so you owe me one.
But in a democracy, it gets even more complex because you have this ideal of political equality, but then you have these super wealthy donors who can potentially exert a lot of influence.
Yeah, like, if someone donates millions to a political campaign, does that give them more say in how the government is run?
That's the question a lot of people are asking. And some argue that big philanthropy is actually kind of undemocratic, that it gives too much power to a small number of people.
So the question becomes, how do we balance the freedom to give with the need to protect democratic values?
Right. Some philosophers, like Cordelli, argue that we need a clear division between the role of the state and the role of private philanthropy.
So, like, certain things should be the responsibility of the government, funded by taxes, and not subject to the whims of individual donors.
Exactly. And others, like Beerbaum, Pevnik, and Lechterman, they're trying to define which public goods are so essential that they should be protected from private influence.
It's about drawing boundaries, right? Making sure that democratic processes aren't undermined by private money.
And then there are folks who are worried about the power dynamics in philanthropy, even if those dynamics aren't explicitly political. This is where relational egalitarianism comes in.
So this is about how even well-intentioned giving can sometimes create these unequal relationships between the giver and the receiver.
Right. Saunders Hastings, for example, argues that we should be wary of paternalistic giving, where the donor is basically dictating how their money is used.
It's about empowering recipients, giving them agency, not just treating them as passive beneficiaries.
But it's not all doom and gloom. There are also thinkers who see philanthropy and democracy as potentially complementary.
Like, Maybe private giving can actually strengthen democracy by supporting a diverse and vibrant civil society.
Right, and that was Reich's argument. He thought philanthropy could fund things like public interest journalism, advocacy groups, all the things that help keep those in power accountable.
And then there are ideas like democratizing philanthropy itself. Pevnik has this proposal for giving everyone equal vouchers to donate to the causes they care about. It's like leveling the playing field so everyone's voice counts, not just the super rich.
And there are also efforts to make foundations more transparent and accountable, using things like participatory budgeting to give communities a say in how funds are used.
So it's not just about individual donors. It's about making the whole philanthropic ecosystem more democratic.
Right. And this extends to the global level, too, with all those international NGOs that rely on philanthropic funding.
There are big questions about how we can ensure that these organizations, which often operate across borders, are accountable to the people they're supposed to be serving.
And now let's talk about the relationship between philanthropy and freedom. Libertarians, as you might expect, see a huge role for private giving.
For them, it's all about individual liberty, limited government.
Exactly. They tend to believe that private charity is more efficient and effective than government aid because it's driven by choice and competition.
So it's about letting people decide how they want to give without the government getting involved.
But Republican theories of freedom, which emphasize the idea of non-domination, well, they're a bit more skeptical.
Because even voluntary giving can sometimes create these power imbalances that restrict people's freedom.
Exactly. They might argue for a stronger welfare state or a universal basic income so people aren't so dependent on the generosity of others.
But they also recognize that a diverse philanthropic landscape can help prevent any single donor from having too much power.
And that philanthropic funding can support those civil society organizations that help keep everyone, including the government, accountable.
It's all about checks and balances, right? Making sure that power is distributed and that no one gets to call all the shots.
All right, let's wrap things up by talking about some of the current controversies around philanthropy. And the first one is the issue of dirty money.
This is about accepting donations from sources that are, well, ethically questionable, right?
Exactly. It could be money from illegal activities, from industries that cause harm, or even just from individuals with a shady past.
And this raises some tough questions, like, is it okay to take money from a polluter to fund environmental conservation?
Non-consequentialist frameworks, like Kant's ethics, would say no, the source of the money matters.
But consequentialists might argue that if the money is going to do good, then the ends justify the means.
Right, and Peter Singer, a well-known utilitarian philosopher, has made this argument in relation to donations from the Sackler family, who made their fortune selling opioids. He says the potential benefits of that money outweigh the moral taint.
But others, like Cordelli, argue that any wealth beyond what someone would have in a just society is morally suspect.
It's a really tough issue with no easy answers.
Okay, another big controversy is corporate giving and the whole idea of corporate social responsibility.
This is about businesses going beyond just making profits and doing things that benefit society.
Like donating to charities, reducing their environmental impact, treating their workers fairly.
Right, but there's a lot of debate about whether this is actually a good thing. Some argue that a corporation's only responsibility is to its shareholders, and that any money spent on CSR is essentially stealing from them.
That's the classic Milton Friedman argument.
Exactly. Others worry that CSR is just a PR stunt, a way for companies to look good without actually changing their behavior.
Like greenwashing their image.
Right. And then there are democratic concerns like, do corporations have too much influence over social issues because of their giving?
Yeah, if a company donates millions to a cause, does that give them more power to shape the agenda?
These are all valid questions. And then there's the issue of the tax treatment of giving.
So in a lot of countries, including the U.S., you get tax breaks for donating to charity.
Right. But critics argue that this system mainly benefits wealthy donors because they're the ones who pay the highest taxes.
So it's like the government is subsidizing the giving of the rich more than the giving of ordinary people.
Exactly. And some have proposed replacing the current deduction system with a flat tax credit, so everyone gets the same benefit regardless of their income.
That would definitely make it more equitable.
It would, but it's a complex issue with a lot of different perspectives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into philanthropy, it's clear that there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. It's this ancient practice that's constantly evolving, and it raises all these profound questions about ethics, politics, and what it means to be a good person in a complex world.
We've covered a lot of ground, from ancient Greek philosophy to cutting-edge debates about effective altruism and the role of corporations. And our hope is that by exploring all these different perspectives, we've given you a deeper understanding of the complexities of giving and its impact on society.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Which of these philosophical viewpoints resonates most with you? How do you think about your own role in philanthropy, whether as a giver or a receiver? And what causes do you think are most deserving of our support?
These are questions worth pondering, folks, and we encourage you to keep digging, to keep thinking critically about how we can make the world a better place through our actions, both big and small.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of a complex topic.
Until then, keep thinking deeply.